Namaste. Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining the Project Bharat podcast. Now, before we begin this podcast and before we get into episode one in earnest, I'd like to share with you the theme and content of this podcast. The simplest way to put it, of course, would be that this is a podcast on Indian history. More accurately, it is a podcast focusing on the slice of Indian history that we can get from Puranic data. But deeper within, in terms of the theme of this podcast, the idea isn't to visit what is purportedly the empirical study of the past. The idea is something different. And to give you a sense for what the idea of this podcast, the theme and intent of this podcast is, I'd like to take you through a quote by Sri K.M. Munshi. Sri K.M. Munshi wrote this quote in his foreword to the book The Vedic Age. So I will read this quote for you that to be a history in the true sense of the word, the work must be a story of the people inhabiting a country. It must be a record of their life from age to age, presented through the life and achievements of the men whose exploits became the beacon lights of tradition, through the efforts of the people to will themselves into organic unity. The central purpose of a history must therefore to investigate and unfold the values which age after age have inspired the inhabitants of a country to develop their collective will and to express it through the manifold activities of their life. Such a history of India is still to be written. So I emphasize over here the part that a history of a people should record the efforts of these people to will themselves into organic unity. And this part is important because it sheds light on the fact that one way to look at history, arguably the correct way to look at history, is to look at it from inside out, is to look at it as the people themselves know it, remember it, think of it, transmit it, and share it among themselves. So, this kind of history of India is yet to be fully explored. And my intent here in the whether we talk about Indus Valley civilization, whether we will talk about in episodes about AI, MT, out of India theory, about Indo-European languages, whether we talk about Puranic stories and what they mean for our history, whether we talk about the development of archaeological cultures, the development of agriculture, the idea is not to be outside viewing in. The idea is through all of these to understand what it tells us about the efforts of ancient Bharatiyas of that time to will themselves into an organic whole. Therefore, it is Bharat's own story of how it became Bharat and perhaps major milestones and epochs along that story. So that is the general theme and intent of this blog. And with that, we can, of course, move to the episode one. Episode one will focus on what history, why history, and how history. What we mean by this is that we will examine what are the various definitions of history, what are some alternate views on what history is or what history ought to be. Having understood this, why should we look at history? Why should we even care? Why should we even bother to find out these things? And finally, how do we find out these things? So, if we do want to figure out history, how do we go about doing that? More specifically, I will talk about what will be the way to do this for myself, at least in this podcast, as the episodes go on. So, let's focus first on the first part: what is history? Now, of course, the origins of this are from the Greek word historia, which means itself the investigation or the knowledge acquired through it. And in the context of history, the word history, it means the investigation or the knowledge acquired through it of the past. So it studies and documents the past, it investigates the past. And therefore, history as we know it as a discipline, as the output of that discipline, is the empirical study of the past. So this is a very straightforward explanation of history. This kind of definition of history is what gives historians authority. What gives them legitimacy, because allegedly they pursue what is an empirical study of the past. Now, that may well be true, but in reality, it doesn't stop there. Because, as is the case not only with most social sciences, but sometimes even with sciences, that even the most objective study, even the most objective investigation is actually filtered through the mind of the investigator. Therefore, in the context of history, History is not just an empirical documentary of the past. History is, in fact, narratives about the past. And this is an important point because it's narratives that we really imbibe. We don't really imbibe just, okay, when some archaeological culture developed. We don't really imbibe only when some genes moved from one place to another or whether some language moved from one place to another. What we are given is an entire narrative of the past. We are given an entire story about the ancient past. So it isn't just an empirical documentary, it is actually an entire narrative. And one quote that I want to highlight here is a quote from Yuval Noah Harari from his book Sapiens, where he says that history is what a few people were doing while the rest of humanity was breaking its back under the sun. Now, what Harari tries to tell us here is that for the most part, we are able to get to history through what is documented of it. So, for example, we know of Hammurabi and Hammurabi's law, book of law. So, we think of Hammurabi as one of the earliest emperors, the earliest sovereigns who tried to develop a book of law. But that may well be true, but it actually tells us nothing about the rest of the populace at Hammurabi's time, which most likely the majority of which was busy in agriculture at that time, construction activities at that time. So this quote from Harari, it demonstrates a definition of history that is very different from how K.M. Munshiji talked about history, which was where history is a record of the people themselves, of their attempts to get into an organic unity, where here he talks about how history is a record of essentially some people in charge or whatever best is left behind through the efforts of those people in charge. So that's one way to look at history. And when we view history in this way, what does stand out is that it is accused or it is said that India has no historical sense. And this is said, when this is said, most Indians might think, oh, well, we have Itihas, we have Puran, we have the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. So how could it be said that India has no historical sense? Well, the truth is that all of us growing up, I'm sure we remember even our history teachers in school telling us that why is history important? And they tell us that history is important so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. More specifically, we don't repeat the mistakes of our own ancestors. Therefore, history, another way to look at it, is history is a way for a people to pass on their learnings and their wisdom for the next generation. Now, this is a drastic departure from the Historia based definition of history that we just looked at. Therefore, the accusation that India has no historical sense is true to the extent that Itihas, the Indian lens of history, it has not cared for Historia over much, and we can understand this through contrasting a story of the West. So in the West, we know the story of Christopher Columbus. We know when he sailed, we know when he reached where he reached, we know who patronized him, who funded him, we know how many ships he sailed with, what were the names of those ships. We probably know where the wood of those ships came from, where the iron, the metal in those ships came from. So we have all of the historia available. But we haven't actually learned the wisdom that we should from history. So whether on the side of Christopher Columbus, we haven't learned a new lesson for how one civilization should interact with another civilization. We haven't learned the lessons that should come from his story of genocide and of essentially the extinction of a foreign civilization. In fact, we haven't even learned from his mistakes so much that we still have a country called West Indies. We haven't even corrected that. In reality, we should actually be thinking of him as Columbus Asur, but we do not. So all of Historia put together actually does not achieve the real importance of history, which is not to repeat mistakes of the past or to learn from the past. Itihas, the Indian lens of history, has at its core, at its focus, dharma or learning or values, the way we should be living, the way we should be conducting ourselves. And therefore, from an Indian point of view, it is not important to remember when Columbus discovered India, the continent of North America. What is important is to learn what were the mistakes made and how could we do better next time. This is why ancient Indians, though we kept passing on our history, we kept passing on our stories, we did not care for Historia. What was important to my grandmother, as she told me stories from the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, was not when Ramayana occurred, not when the war of Mahabharata occurred, not how earliest can we find archaeological evidence of inhabitation in modern Ayodhya. No. What was more important is, have we learned from the life of Ram? Have we learned from the life of Lakshman, from the life of Sita, Ravan, or all the characters of the Mahabharata? What can we learn from Karn? What can we learn from Ashwatthama? What questions about dharma, what ambiguities, dilemmas about dharma can we explore through these stories? That was always more important. And that is what Indians always meant when they talked about itihas. So that is a broad context of what we mean by history and what could be some different definitions of history. The Indian lens of it, to understand that, I would like to draw up an analogy. And this part is important because this informs how I look at Indian history, and this informs how we will deal with all of these subjects in further episodes as well. So when we think of consciousness, we know it's something experienced by an individual. And sure, even an amoeba may be conscious to the degree that an amoeba may be conscious to light and to other stimuli. But certainly, when we think of consciousness, we attribute it as a qualifier to Homo sapiens, because we see that the expression of consciousness, as we found in Homo sapiens, is more complex, more varied than in any other life form. So, cognitive scientists, they like to tell us that consciousness is how information feels when processed in increasingly complex ways. Therefore, there is a degree of consciousness that an amoeba also has. There is a degree of consciousness a bacteria has, a butterfly has. But there is a degree of consciousness which, in the human brain, because information is being processed in highly complex ways, generates the felt experience that we all know and that we all can confirm through the I think, therefore I am axiom. So, similarly, as consciousness is to an individual, civilization is to the collective. What do I mean by this? So, collectives can be of various types, right? There can be a family collective, there can be a tribal collective, a kin collective, a town collective, a village collective, a culture collective. And these to me are lower grades of the collective, because as you bring more and more humans together, as you have more and more networks and the network size increases, information in this collective is being processed in more and more complex ways. So when this processing of information in increasingly complex ways happens in an individual, it leads to consciousness. When it happens in the collective, it leads to civilization. Therefore, as consciousness is to an individual, civilization is to the collective. Now, framing it this way allows us to understand history in a very different manner. Because what is consciousness? Well, consciousness is underpinned by a continuum of memory, an unbroken continuum of memory. So, you, the listener, you have your own journey, you have your own trajectory, you have your own continuum of memory. And without that continuum, you wouldn't feel you. That continuum is an essential part of who you are, it is a part of your felt experience. And to visit that continuum, to understand that continuum in many ways, is to understand you yourself. Similarly, is history to the civilization. So, as memory is to consciousness, history is to the civilization. It is history or the civilizational memory. It is a continuum of the felt experience of being. And this is a very different way to look at history, because now it's not that we dismiss of or will ignore empirical historia. It's that all of empirical historia will be used only to supplement what we already know, which is our own felt experience, our own memory of our civilizational past. So, in this entire podcast, whenever we talk of history, whenever we explore history, what we are trying to do is to find out the Bharatiya felt experience of its own past. And another way to look at this is summarized by Professor Balagangadhar, who we will visit once again. He has a fantastic paper, which I will add in the list of references, on history and how we should view history, and how the modern lens of history has come. So Professor Balagangadhar says that history is simply the past, which is, it is a people's own story about their past. That is what history is. And when we look at it that way, history with a capital H, the Historia defined history, what it actually is, it is the subjective felt experience of one civilization, not our civilization, but a civilization that through the trajectory colonized a large part of the world, and today perhaps owns the cultural paradigm or leads the cultural paradigm of our species itself. So history with a capital H is the subjective experience of one civilization universalized, of their collective will towards organic unity. And when we speak of history, or when we examine history with a capital H, when we examine Indian history, what we're actually doing is we're trying to examine the past of one civilization through all the lenses acquired from the felt experience of a different civilization. This argues for a whole new revisit and recalibration of how we look at history, especially Indian history, where we have to change the lenses and put in the lenses of the insider, not the outsider. So therefore, India's history, and which in fact is Bharat's history, that is its own story of the past, that is what we will actually study in terms of history. And that is what we want to find out. Our interest is not an empirical study of the past per se. It is in fact a subjective study of the past, because history is similar to memory. And as unique a memory is to an individual, and as special memory is to an individual, it's that unique and that special a history is to a civilization. We can move now to the second part, which is why history. So we've established now that what are the different ways of looking at history and how we may go about it. But why do we even study it? Why does it even matter? Well, there are different ways to approach this. For one, we can care about historia. So why should we study historia, or all the details, the documentation, the output of empirical investigation? Why should we care about that? Why should we care about our own story of the past? Then that is the alternate question. So if we look at both these definitions of history, why should we care about either of them? The answer to that lies in understanding, of course, that history is a narrative. So Indian history, as we know today in the mainstream, as discovered by Indology, it is a narrative. It is a narrative of the Indian felt experience, but narrated by a different civilization with its own felt experience. Therefore, we have to, of course, counter it. We have to, of course, challenge it. And it is important to remove those lenses and colors before we understand our own past and our own ancestors. For that same reason, just like if you disturb a person's memory, if you remove parts from their memory, or if somehow you are able to prevent them from accessing their own memory, you are stunting the person. You are limiting the person from realizing themselves fully and from expressing themselves fully, because you have just messed with the felt continuum of being. For that same reason, Indian history is important to India itself. And going a step further, using a phrase that I first encountered through Sri Rajiv Malhotra, it is important to our civilizational grand narrative. Just like your autobiography and your journey so far is important to who you are today and will inform who you will go on to be in the future. In that same sense, our history, our own story of the past is important to where we are today, why we are the way we are, and of course will play a big role how we look at that past. It will play a big role in how we move to the future and what we are in the future. So that is one very big reason why we should care about history, regardless of how it's defined or what its epistemology is, because both ways where we end up is at a narrative. So whether that narrative is our own narrative or the narrative of an outsider, whether that narrative is for our own interest and does justice to our own past or it doesn't, these are important things. Therefore, of course, we must engage with and dialogue with and challenge history and find ways to own and define the narrative through our own felt experience. Now, against this, of course, here is another quote by Professor S.N. Balagangadhar. And I do recommend people read his paper, which I will reference in this video in the links provided. So here I read the quote that why study the past instead of recounting your community's story about the past? Which is to say that if we have the story, so if we have the Purans, if we have the Mahabharata, if we have the Ramayana, and we know the stories in them, why do we need to study them from a historia point of view? And the professor says, I mean, why are we not satisfied in recounting Ramayana, Mahabharata, Purans as our stories about the past? Why do we need to study? And to these questions, there is a plausible sounding answer. We need to know whether these stories are true. Ask again, why do we need to know whether these stories are true? After all, as we believe, these stories have been in circulation for millennia and have adequately and admirably met the needs of our ancestors and most of our contemporaries as well in their quest for human flourishing. So, What extra reasons exist to study the past? So this is a very important question that Professor Balagangadhar raises, and it is most definitely it does justice to the inside view, to the Indian view of history, which I talked about previously. The trueness or the historical, literal truth of the Mahabharata was never important to our ancestors, and they always cared more about the deeper truths, the spiritual truths, the existential truths that were there in those stories. And as long as they were able to engage with them, explore them, learn from them, and transmit them, a historical empirical study was never important. That's fair enough. And of course, I can't say that I would be able to contest or counter Professor Bal Gangadhar here. But let me offer a few suggestions. So let's ask ourselves that what may we know about the lived experience of people along the Saraswati, let us say at around 3000 BC? So we know that the river existed at that time. The archaeology can tell us a lot. It will tell us about the material culture of those people. Perhaps one day we find out conclusively the language they wrote. We would find out what technologies they possessed and what they did not possess. But fundamentally, all of this is to say that we know how central this river has been to our civilization. So therefore, should we not commit inquiry into finding out what that lived experience was like? More importantly, we know that river died out. So with its drying up, what would have happened to our civilizational continuities? How would they have been disrupted? What kind of challenges must have that kind of geological and definitive process thrown up for our civilization? How did our ancestors react to this? And how did they work around these discontinuities or try to preserve aspects of their tradition as a great civilization migrated away from the Saraswati primarily towards the Ganga Yamuna? Then, once we ask these questions, what could that tell us on a notion like Triveni, which is a notion about Prayag, right? Prayag being a meeting ground not just for Ganga and Yamuna, but actually metaphorically, the belief is that it is a meeting ground for the third river, Saraswati. So what we have here is a series of archaeological, geological, and ultimately cultural phenomena which give rise to something like Triveni. And in studying all of this, will we not be able to find out something about a people's organic unity, about how they've built towards to this organic unity? I think it will. So this series of questions gives us one example or one reason why certainly we should study history and we should be interested even in Historia, because it informs us about our own journey towards organic unity or the origination of ideas, of notions, of institutions that make Bharat Bharat and that make Dharma what it is. Viewed from another lens and to highlight another reason why history is important, ask yourselves, are there such a people as Aryans and Dravidians? Could we look at an Indian today, a random Indian today, and say he or she is more Aryan or more Dravidian, or less Aryan and less Dravidian? And are some of us original inhabitants, Adivasis, as the name suggests, which automatically implies that some of us aren't? Some of us displaced them, conquered them, invaded them, destroyed their cultures, etc. And does harmony in modern India, even if we accept foreign invasions and conquests, does harmony in modern India require that we whitewash whatever invasions and conquests happened? So these questions, what they are trying to highlight is that using narrative, which is what history is, one can certainly divide, one can certainly put fault lines. And let's use the analogy again. So if you want to subvert an individual, one of the ways to do it is to play with the individual's memory, to make them question their memory, to implant false memories, to challenge whatever they remember. They say that this is what happened, and you tell them that no, you're remembering it wrong. This didn't happen at all. These are ways that you can seriously mess with an individual. Similarly, you can do the same with history, because history is the memory of a civilization. So if you want to subvert a civilization, if you want to play with its sense of self, if you want to make it question its identity today, if you want to seed fault lines and cracks in its psyche, you can use narrative and you can use history. So certainly history can be used to divide, but it can also be used to unite. And in order to use narrative to unite, we will have to rely more or give more respect to Sri K. M. Munshi's view of history than to a empirical Historia-based view of history. Now, are dates and chronologies important? This becomes a very important question when we look at why history, which is to say, and we've alluded to this before, That is it important when the Mahabharata happened for the story to be felt true and be a part of our past? Is it important when Ram was coronated and what year that was, for us to take Ram as a national hero, for us to relate to his story, for us to learn from his story? The answer to this, of course, is no and yes. And I put it in this order because saying no to this, first of all, we must acknowledge, does more justice to the Indian felt experience. Because no, it does not matter to our own story of the past what the dates were and what the chronologies were. Not at all. And therefore, within that lens, debates on when the Mahabharata happened, whether it was 1900 BC, 5000 BC, or whatever date, to that extent, none of that is of interest to Itihas, because Itihas is a way for Bharat to pass on Dharma to its future generations. That's what it is. So, from that extent, no. But yes, I also say dates and chronologies are important to get a sense for why I say that. Let us look at some examples. So, we know from archaeology that even as far back as 9000 BC, which is now more than 11,000 years ago, in Bagor in modern Rajasthan, we have found idols of feminine goddesses. And we found evidence that the people of that time certainly had some kind of worship, ritual, or religious engagement with these idols. Now, in our own record, the Puranic record, we know that the first Manvantar, Swayambhuv Manu, and his descendants, they fashioned idols of Devi and worshipped Devi. We now have the scientific evidence on phases of the Saraswati's decline. And eventually, of course, it demised altogether. Now, if we look at the Rig Veda, which is our scripture, our text, a record of our own people from our past, in the Rig Veda, the Saraswati is a raging river. But in the Mahabharata describes a river on the decline. In fact, in the Mahabharata's time, the Saraswati does not even meet the ocean. Finally, if we look at something like the trajectory of organized agriculture, so we know that in India, where agriculture did come about indigenously, we are able to identify a trajectory dating, let us say, starting from around 6000 BC, although even as far back as 7000 BC in Lahurateva near modern Ayodhya, we have evidence of organized rice agriculture. But wherever we put the dates, contrast that with the story from our Purans, where prior to Prithu Venya, who was the first Chakravartin, and the Purans say that he was in the sixth Manvantar, they also say, the same Purans, that prior to him, people consumed untilled grain. And in fact, even in other stories that are within the Puranic relative chronology are of the same era as Prithu. For example, stories of the Samudra Manthan, of Mahabali, all of these are consistent that this was an era without the tilling of grain. In fact, Prithu is attributed as the person who tilled the grain and, in fact, yoked the earth or Prithvi. So when we look at this, what is it giving us? It is giving us unmistakable hints on where we could place these stories in time, on how we could map these stories to a graph of our calendar and do so in a plausible way. In cases like the trajectory of organized agriculture, the stories give unmistakable clues and almost irrefutable macro historical data. So, therefore, let us concede that we don't need chronology obsession. We don't need battles for people to prove that their chronology is right or their dating is right. I myself, in further episodes, will share my chronological framework and reasons for it. But there is a reason why I call it a chronological framework. And I certainly don't think that the debate on dates of the Mahabharata or the Ramayana can ever be conclusively settled. There's never going to be a victor. And we should understand, if we are viewing these things from the Indian point of view, that we don't need a victor. We just need a plausible mapping that can allow us to map our own story of the past to what is being discovered by the fields of archaeology, genetics, linguistics, etc. So, for that sense, yes, it does not matter, but just same similar to how dates and years are important to an individual for who they are, their life story. People remember when they first fell in love, they remember when they got their first job, and things like that. So there are milestones which are important in defining a person's journey. Similarly, there are milestones which are important in defining a civilization's story. So, to that extent, dates and chronologies are important, yes. And to shed more light on this, to emphasize this. Uh, we can visit some of the court of K. Munshi again. So our objective, of course, is to find the efforts of people to will themselves into organic unity. But this happens along a time depth. This happens along a continuum of the arrow of time. And therefore, I think what Sri Aurobindo says helps us put more salience here. Sri Aurobindo says that the human mind, in its progress, marches knowledge to knowledge, renews and enlarges previous knowledge, often obscured or overlaid, seizes on old imperfect clues, and is led by them to new discoveries. So, what Sri Aurobindo is hinting here, that civilization or the collective also has a journey. It progresses forward. It builds upon the past. It inherits something from its ancestors, comes up with new things, and then puts more material on top, which is to say that its civilization is built along time and time depth. To that extent, it would, of course, help us to understand that what was the formulation of people in India about dharma 7,000 years ago? Are there epochs we can find? Are there personalities we can find who moved the clock ahead in a significant way? After all, we have the notion of Chakravartins, who literally it is reduced, of course, to just, someone whose wheel moves in all directions. And the interpretation is that this, talked about sovereigns who were able to conquer large territories. But Chakra itself is a very philosophical concept for our civilization. And it is indeed the wheel of time. So a Chakravartin for our people was also someone who moved the wheel of time forward. It is therefore that Prithu Venya is called the first Chakravartin because of the kind of revolution ushered with his association. Therefore, why is history important? And even when we study it from the insider view, from the Indian view, why should we care about history, about historia, about dates, about chronologies? To the extent that, number one, we may know the Indian experience of how we willed ourselves towards organic unity. And number two, so that we may know the major milestones and eras of import in our civilizational journey so far. So that covers the section on why history, and now we can finally move to how history. Having understood history and defined history the way we have, how do we go about finding it out? And I think it should be apparent by now that the best way to find a people's own story is from their own records. So we have for us an entire compendium of the Itihas Puran compendium. Now, there are, of course, legitimate questions on what is true in them and what can we find out in them that informs us on the story of our own past. We will, of course, uncover this in future episodes, especially when we talk about the entire chronological framework. But I think, just to give some examples here, the Purans are replete with information about 12 great Dev Asur wars. And the way they talk about the eras of those times, it's very clear that they're talking about nomadic times. They're talking about times prior to organized agriculture, prior to advanced metallurgy. And so there are enough hints in them that we can figure out that what was the relatively pre-technological, pre-cultural, pre-civilizational stage of our people. And it makes sense that this would be that kind of stage because how do you even transmit information? How do you make sure that your own memories and your own wisdom is passed along in eras where there was no writing, no organized storage of knowledge, no organized transmission of knowledge, essentially just families teaching stories and carrying them forward? So we know that what kind of eras were they, and we're able to identify this from the Purans itself. Now, there are some other examples I want to share. So the Purans are specific. They mention this across various Purans on the trajectory of human evolution. And I don't mean biological evolution of the natural selection kind, but of human society and human living. So the Purans are explicit. They say that at first humans lived in jungles and on trees, which is that they remember that our species has an arboreal past. Then they say that once we emerged from these, we went out and there were vast, grasslands, and therefore humans then settled down in the caves, in the hills, in the mounds for shelter, where they could also be protected from wild animals and elements of nature. This was an era, the Purans tell us, when there was no agriculture. People ate raw grain, raw vegetable. And so we are able to understand that they're talking about a pre-agricultural state. Then the Purans tell us that finally people moved out from this state and they learned how to till the earth. Therefore, they remember the agricultural stage. And beyond this, they talk about the evolution of different kinds of settlements, of cities, and temporary settlements, of cosmopolitan settlements. So there is this vast depth of macro historical memory already there in the Purans. And if we want to talk about micro historical memory, about historia, of course, there are a lot of genealogies, a lot of stories about kings and rishis, which tells us so much about not just genealogy itself, but about geography, about who might have contributed in what way to our civilizational trajectory. And in fact, when we really parse it through to detail, we can figure out a lot more about archaeological dimensions, such as the Indus Valley civilization, the ochre colored pottery civilization, and so on. So now Itihas Purans, of course, within themselves, they have minutiae such as various things about yugs and manvantars to parse, about manus and rishis and their lineages, about chakravartins, devs, asurs and their wars, genealogies and geographies. But keeping in mind the way that we look at history, what's appreciable is that they also tell us a lot about the evolution of dharma, about the trajectory of thought development, and about the crystallization of ideas and institutions. So this will continue to be our base. We will certainly use this to inform ourselves about ancient Indian history now that we understand history as a civilization's own experience and own memory of how it came into being. Of course, we will map this and supplement this with whatever we can gather from empirical history, quote unquote, things about the Sindhu Saraswati civilization, phases of the Indus Valley civilization, origins and dispersals of languages, the flux of genes, inscriptions and coins and accounts from travelers and visitors. So all of this is, of course, data that must be incorporated in a complete model that helps us understand and narrate the story of Bharat. So, what can Itihas Puran tell us? Of course, and what can be supplemented or acquired from Historia? These are the two things that will keep in our focus, and that covers the theme so far, right? So, this episode was about what history, why history, how history, and if we are to revise what we've discussed so far, the framework for all the future podcasts. It's going to be what history? Well, India's own story of the past, a record of how Bharatiyas willed themselves towards organic unity. That was what the history is that we will study. Why will we study it? So that we may reconnect ruptured synaptic nerves, because it is essential to strengthening the civilizational grand narrative to know why we are and why we are the way we are, who we are, and how we got here. That is why we will study history. And of course, how will we study it? From our own record of the past, from our own stories passed down the generations, without need of technicians, which is a word I'm using here for historians and scholars. So without the need of technicians to help us document and store this memory. Which is to say that, of course, we have a past and we don't need academic empirical disciplines to engage with this past, to assert this past, and to let it inform us as we move to the future as a civilization. So that's it. Thank you very much. I hope this first episode was of relevance to you. I would love your feedback and see you next time. Namaste.